A few years ago, I went to go visit some of the sites associated with the Luddite Uprising, which lasted from around 1811 to 1816. But this uprising was the tip of the iceberg. In reality, these protests began in the early 1700s and wouldn't end until decades after the uprising itself began. And it happened at a very inopportune time for the revolutionaries, because it was a time of war. Because it was the Napoleonic War, mostly the British government associated these men and women with anti-government sentiments and would oftentimes sentence them to death. But in reality, these were mostly pro-government peasant class who just supported doing away with the modern industrial technology that was rendering their traditional production obsolete. Now, to kind of get a personal perspective from this, just imagine the year's 1811, and you own a mom-and-pop weaving shop in the hills outside of Nottingham. The Napoleonic Wars are going on, and because of this, the newly independent country of America has declared the Embargo Act. And France, on top of this, has pretty much blockaded all of the British Isles. So, production depends on the people. But in all of this, the economy is just in the ditches. And because of the textile mills, the people who would traditionally turn to you are turning to big businessmen. And overnight, the people that invested in the textile mills pretty much gain a foothold. They became robber baron type figures. And in 1779, a semi-mythical figure, a boy by the name of Ned Ludd from Nottingham, rose to prominence when he went to go work as an apprentice at a milling shop, and he saw what was happening to the traditional way of life. He destroyed 2 mills, and then he ran off into Sherwood Forest. Well, by 1811, the Luddites had formed, kind of around what they called General Ludd, or King Ludd. And according to them, it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek mythology. This boy had run off into Sherwood Forest, where Robin Hood used to hide out, and he had become a general of his own army. And it also drew upon this kind of nativist British mythology, because King Ludd was one of the original kings of the British Isles before the Romans ever got there. So, again, you see this common thread of they're not necessarily anti-Britain, anti-government, they're just anti-modernism. So, in order to get past the tough restrictions that the British government has passed on forming unions or even friendly societies, the only means that they have at their disposal of protest is showing up, destroying the mills, burning them down, and killing the mill owners.
Come, cropper lads of high renown, who love to drink strong ale that's brown, and strike each haughty tyrant down with hatchet, pike, and gun. The cropper lads for me, the gallant lads for me, who with lusty stroke the sheer frames broke, the cropper lads for me.
There's no other way. Obviously, if you try to form a workers' union, they'll just shoot you or hang you. They've done it before, and they would do it later. So the only way around it was direct action. And so your friend would invite you to this pub. Specifically, this pub outside of Nottingham was used to initiate your oath of loyalty to this supposed king, Ned Ludd, and you would kind of swear allegiance to him and his armies. And by early 1811, there were drills held outside of Nottingham in the moors. By early 1812, these drills were expanding into West Riding, and by 1813, they were basically cutting England in half. They were on the Scottish borders, and they went from coast to coast, burning down the mills and attacking the mill owners, and the British government reacted very violently against this, to a point where, for a while at its height, more British soldiers were fighting Luddites than they were fighting the French in the Napoleonic Wars. Now that says quite a bit. In fact, one of the few British politicians to sympathize with them, or at least not believe that they were the boogeyman that they were made out to be, was Lord Byron himself. In February 1812, he said, quote, "I have been in some of the most oppressed provinces of Turkey, but never, under the most despotic of infidel governments, did I behold such squalid wretchedness as I have seen in my return, in the very heart of a Christian country."
Of danger, right onward we go. When up go our colours and down go the foe. Be they Russians or Prussians or Spanish or French, at scaling a rampart or guarding a trench, Not a bayonet, no bullet, progress retards, for it's just all the same to the gallant diehards. Our regiment's conquered, but never in vain. They'll witness those hills and the mountains in Spain. They'll witness the shades of those hundreds who fell at Red Albuera, and a victory can tell how
soldiers had begun guarding the mills, and the Luddites, which were previously pro-British government, began clashing with soldiers. And one of the mill owners was heard to say, "I've hired out my own private security team, and I intend to ride up to my saddle in the blood of Luddites." Well, the Luddite leader named George Mellor got together a squad of 3 other people and tracked him down, ambushed him, found him, and shot him in the balls, and he bled to death. So the British government responded by creating a show trial in the town of York, and they got together 60 people who were simply just weavers, working men, middle class. And immediately the court released 30 of them because there was no evidence to support anything that was being leveled against them. And George Mellor was executed, he was hanged, and his 3 accomplices were also ordered hanged, but because one of them switched over and decided to be a spy for the British government, they let that guy go. And everybody else, all the other 30 people, were sentenced to life in jail, to transportation, to incredibly heavy fines, and it was done in a way that would intimidate anybody else from actually rising. I mentioned earlier the quote that Lord Byron gave in front of the House of Commons in 1812, and to say that Lord Byron supported the Luddites would be a bit of an overstatement, but he was supportive of not treating them like literal human garbage. Well, the government didn't see it that way, and eventually about 60 people were given a show trial in York. And most of these people had no connection to the Luddite movement at all. But they wanted to send a message to the people that you couldn't have an uprising and actually target the aristocrats, the landowners, the company owners, and the people with the monopolies on the industry. And so a good number of them were killed and buried here in this churchyard, martyrs of the workers' movement. This is the poor man's plot of the church in Liver's Edge, and since the last time I've come here, the sign has been either torn down or worn off. And it makes me sad because a monument this important to the working people deserves at least some larger sort of remembrance. Something like what they were given the workers, the Chartists in Wales. And the last action taken would be years later, and it wasn't actually directly related to the Luddite Uprising. In fact, it was simply the Pentrick Rising of 1916, and the guy who initiated this was an ex-Luddite, a man by the name of Jeremiah Brandreth. And after this 1816 revolt, he and his 2 accomplices became some of the last people to be beheaded with an axe in front of a crowd in the UK. Immediately after they were beheaded, they held Brandreth, the leader of the revolution's head, aloft. Nobody in the crowd cheered, and so the cavalry was waiting atop the hill with their sabers at the ready to charge into the crowd and kill anybody who would dare start a riot. But nobody really raised their fists, and it just fizzled out. As many other events in history, nothing ever came of it. And you can see the trend with modern Luddites, or what you would call neo-Luddites, people who support turning back the tide. When you talk about Luddites, there's often this misconception that they are basically just Ted Kaczynski hiding out in a cabin somewhere in Montana. In reality, they're just people who support turning back total automation, because these people can see that people who support automation are the top earners, the people who are at the very top of the social ladder, who will only continue to profit off of slave labor automation because they got into the process early. In reality, everybody who is part of the middle class will either have to capitulate and join in the ranks of the peons underneath these kind of industrial robber barons, or they'll have to find a new industry which is only going to be revolutionized in the next couple of years. So with the rate at which industrial society is advancing, there is no way to keep up. And Neo-Luddites say that there is an active revolt which must take place in order to stop this advance. It's not necessarily turning back the tides to year zero. This isn't Khmer Rouge we're talking about. It's simply returning back to a way at which you could maximize production to the middle class, where you would have an economy of middle class people that wasn't focused on an information economy. An economy in which the countries that control the flow of information control the distribution of power or control the destiny of the world's future. It's a society in which people will genuinely be able to see the fruits of their labor and control their own destinies.